Hi, this is Estelle Erasmus, your host for Freelance Writing Direct. In this short, soundbite-filled podcast, I'll cover everything the freelance and creative writer and author needs to do to move forward with their writing, their creativity, and their career. Through conversations with guests, we'll cover tips, tricks, and actionable strategies. So join me every week and grow your business and build your craft with Freelance Writing Direct. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes and Spotify. Hi, everybody. It's Estelle Erasmus, and I'm so thrilled to announce that my book, Writing That Gets Noticed, Find Your Voice, Become a Better Storyteller, Get Published, is out and available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, IndieBound, and wherever books are sold. So I would love it if you'd pick up a copy, and I think you'll learn a lot. Thanks. Bye-bye. Welcome, everybody, to Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host, Estelle Erasmus, and today I'm so excited to have Kelly McMasters join us. And she is going to be speaking with us about all things literary in this episode titled The Literary Gifts of Kelly McMasters' The Leaving Season. And I'm talking about her wonderful book, The Leaving Season. So I want to give you a little bit more information about Kelly. And of course, if you're enjoying Freelance Writing Direct, make sure you subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes and Spotify. So a little bit about Kelly. She's the co-editor of the national bestseller Wanting, Women Writing About Desire, and the author of Welcome to Shirley, a memoir from an atomic town, an Orion Book Award nominee. Her essays have appeared in The Atlantic, New York Times, Literary Hub, and more. And she teaches writing at Hofstra University and lives on Long Island. Welcome to the program, Kelly.
Thank you so much for having me, Estelle. I'm really excited to be here.
I'm excited to have you here. And there's so much I want to cover with your wonderful book. You wrote about so many themes: the dissolution of a marriage, losing and finding yourself, dealing with the vicissitudes of motherhood. Why did you decide to share your story, your memoir and essays?
So I think the sharing part came as an afterthought. I am a nonfiction writer by trade. It's how I think, it's how I process. And so as I worked toward building these essays, I wrote a few before I realized they were cohering into a book. And it was only afterwards that I understood and I could see this through line of leaving that I really understood that it was a holistic story that was being told, that there was an arc chronology, but also through my own story. I am not telling this story because I think it is unique in any way. In fact, the opposite. Pretty much after the story ends, after I leave you on the last page, that's sort of the part of my life that I'm living in right now. And that is a period where I'm able to look back at it with distance, and folks keep coming up to me and asking me for thoughts, advice. Did this happen to you? Did you feel this way when you were going through divorce or changing your job or, single parenting? And I realize these are all questions that where people, and particularly women, feel so alone because each of them has shame attached. And so we're afraid to talk about it. And so now that I have some distance from these years that are in the book, I wanted to put that story out there because it is so common. And I don't think I understood it when I was going through it.
That makes so much sense. And I like that you mentioned about distance, because you really do need distance to be able to write about difficult subjects. The emotion is still there, but you're able to be more coherent with how you explain it and process it, I suppose, and then put it on the page. So thanks for that explanation. So you use so much wonderful metaphor and simile throughout your book, which makes it a literary memoir. And as I said, a literary gift. And some phrases that I love and I noted, like, are on page 51. He smokes and paints or draws in the corner, raising his easel up or down with a metal crank, like the old machines in beach towns that flatten out pennies. And she's talking about her ex, who is a painter. Or on page 57, the fascia board that trimmed the roof's edge was too short, like a skimpy miniskirt riding up on too much leg. I love that one. Can you talk a bit about your choices and making this a literary memoir and your process as well?
It's a really interesting question to think about in terms of intent. I think for me, my first book, which was Welcome to Shirley, a memoir from an atomic town, was an environmental memoir. And I think there was more intent to do exactly what you're describing in that book, because in my classroom, I talk about it as the spinach and the brownie, right? So anybody who was a mom in the 2000s knows the trick of trying to put spinach and bake the spinach in the brownie so your kids don't realize they're eating spinach, but it's a healthy brownie, right? And so with an environmental memoir with a lot of science, I did really focus on trying to manage the balance of memoir and beauty with scientific information, right? And so I wasn't writing to scientists, I was writing to just the average common reader. And in order to, and I'm not a scientist, so in order for me to understand a scientific idea, often I would need to imagine it in a way that was closer to something in my life. And so I would go through that process and try and explain, an aquifer like a colander, like a pasta colander, right? Something like that, where it was helping me, but it was also helping a reader who might not be scientifically adept in those terms. So with this, I think it wasn't the science, but it was the landscape itself. I think I go through in this book and chart city, country, and then we end in suburbia, which is where I still am today. And I think each place is sort of the atomic town version. I think most people are familiar with one, maybe two places, have lived in one or two types of places, a big city, a small town, but each place was so specific. And I really wanted, because so much of this book is about identity and who we are in different places, I needed the understanding of the place to percolate through, to understand how it acted and activated different identities as I or other people moved through those spaces. And so I think, again, my comfort zone, I don't write poetry, but I read so much poetry. And I think poets are just the absolute masters of capturing an idea or an image and a feeling through metaphor or simply through image, right? Evoking an emotion through image. And so I really steeped myself in a lot of poetry during this time and tried to, I know I'm not a poet, but tried to at least deliver some of that through those lines.
And you really did. I feel like that is the difference between making something a literary memoir as opposed to just a regular memoir that doesn't have that aspect, because you do so much more. I mean, you braid in different themes. One of the things in the chapter, Our Castle Year, and you can see I really studied this book. I love this book. You say the place is perfectly manageable for a single mother pretending not to be a single mother, which is, you show a lot of insight. And you also talk about how in some ways it was easier once you became effectively, maybe not even divorced yet, but acting as a single mother.
Mhm.
And you equate your situation to various outside elements throughout the book and braid them in. Like, for example, when the boys learn chess, and you equated how the pieces are used and how the rook is used to kind of capture the king or put the king in a box, and you equated that with your own situation. Or you talk about a cow and you equate that with the broken men and these unsavory men that you were ensconced with when you were living in the farmhouse out in the country. Or you quote from other works such as Foucault, spaces that accumulate time, such as museums and libraries, are a reservoir of imagination. And you make a correlation between the barn being a kind of museum, and you say the taxonomy of Rock Lake and his layering of the natural world, the tools of work, the blood and oil and piss matted into the dirt floor. So you use all these tools and techniques to continue building your story and making your story more than just a story of a woman going through divorce and realizing a marriage isn't fitting her life or self anymore. So can you talk a little bit, I know it's a lot, but can you talk about kind of like your process and these decisions? Because I think that our viewers and listeners will learn so much hearing how you've created this wonderful structure to tell this very universal story that yet is very personalized.
First, I will say that this was probably in process, whether I understood it to be or not, for about 10 years. And so and not just because I was living it for that long, but I think the essay form is where everything kind of builds out from. And I fell in deep love with the essay form when I was in my 20s. There's something so exciting to me about it, about creative nonfiction and its flexibility, the permission it gives a writer to explore and use the fictive elements, everything that we've already been talking about, and the strategies of combining real life. And it does feel like a chessboard in many ways, where you have all of the parts there and you are in control of how you move it and what the next steps are. And so I find that endlessly fascinating and a really fun puzzle each time I sit down to write and work on an essay. And so I think for me, while this is a holistic memoir, you can read it from beginning to end, but you can also hop in and out of the individual essays. So each essay is its own. But when I know that I want to write about something, it feels almost like, those slot machines in like Atlantic City. So often something might hit me and just stick in the little writer part of the brain where it's happening. And there's a little thing back here that's saying, I think you should write about this. Hold on to this, pay close attention, right? And I might not know why. It could be on a walk. It could be something really intense happening. And then only when something else matches the emotional resonance to that first idea. And so the slot machine is sort of like, it's the emotional resonance idea. When two or three things strike together, that's when I know, okay, I've got to put a lasso around this and see why these feel the same to me, because often I won't know until the second or third draft. And I'll write into it and I'll try and figure out, how do these two pieces fit together? Why do they live together in that part of my writing brain? And usually, I love Vivian Gornick's The Situation and the Story, right?
I love that book. Oh.
Life-changing, so short, so brilliant. And just that, again, distance, right? The distance that you can step away from your story and think, what are these layers happening? What is the situation, right? Those are the little slot machine moments. the lasso, the thing that coheres them, is the story, right? Why am I writing? Why are these connected? What am I trying to say with all of these three images or scenes or ideas? And I think for each essay in this book, that is really where they each started. And then to sort of, I think initially, actually, when we sold this book on proposal, it was city, country, Arctic, which sounds hilarious now, but I had just visited Svalbard, which is very close to, it is the Arctic, and I was obsessed with the Arctic. And I had written this piece for the New York Times about glaciers and divorce, and this it would talk about metaphor. It just spoke to me, right? And I thought, okay, that's where I'm going to end this. And in conversations with my amazing editor, who said, I don't know, the Arctic doesn't feel right. And I was, in the same way that I did when we were speaking before this, was sort of rolling my eyes about suburbia and saying, oh yes, I'm in suburbia, the trees don't smell, here I am, the one place I swore I would never end up, back on Long Island where I started, all of these things. And she said, I think you need to write about that. And again, discomfort, right? So these emotional resonance bits, discomfort. I love entering into an essay not knowing why I'm there and figuring out what I'm trying to figure out along the way. But that's the drafting, right? That's the revision. I never end there. Then you go back to the beginning, and with that knowledge of, oh, this is where we're ending, this is what I'm trying to say, and then move to the end with that knowledge in the second or third draft.
Fascinating. So can I ask a little bit about your process? Do you write notes? Like I write note when I'm writing an essay or something, I write notes on my phone, just like in my little drafts, that section. And then I go back to it. That's how I've written some New York Times essays. It's crazy.
Right. I went to see Maggie Smith a few weeks ago, come and read in Brooklyn from her gorgeous new memoir, also about divorce, You Could Make This Place Beautiful. And she's a poet. And somebody asked her about her decision to include her children in the story. And her answer really fascinated me, because she said, very honestly, I spend so much more time parenting than I do writing. It's more honest, right? But I think what you just spoke about is, even when we're not, writing, we're writing. And so when it's percolating, when you're in the shower, when you're driving, when you're walking, all of those notes and all of the ways that you're connecting, that's writing. That's a part of the writing process too. When you're walking the dog, when you're taking the kids to, camp or whatever, that is all part of it. And I would say for me, a lot of it is that messy notes. I love note cards. So for a period, I take a whole wall and it's just note cards, and individual essays will have maybe 20 note cards. And then once it became the book, and I'm sure I have photos I can send to you. I remember I was fortunate enough to go on my first artist residency at the VCCA, which is a magical place. And so we're in this little Virginia, gorgeous old farm, and they had I walked in and all the walls were made of cork. And I thought, how did they know? Like, this is the room I always dreamed of, but could never make, because pinning stuff to the wall, just moving things around. And I would have each essay, this started, I think probably there were at least 7 essays that were in at one time that then were removed. They did not fit the arc. And then I think 5 or 6 were written new just through the process, when I realized there was a hole. And some were published earlier, but I think only 4 of them were previously published. So it really was like a chess match with myself. But the process is messy. And I love that part, because I know when I'm in the classroom, the hardest students to crack are the ones that are really precious about their first drafts. And I think that's the most important thing. Just know that you can safely save all of your drafts. You always have that to go back to. Okay. You've got to wrestle it and tear it apart and build it back up again, try a new opening, try a different ending. And only that will get you to the point that you need to be for the next revision.
That is so helpful to hear. I think so many people are struggling with, how do I even start a structure? What do I even do? And they think it has to be perfection from the get-go. And I teach at NYU, and I always tell my students, you just sit down and you write that first draft, everything that's in your head. And when you go to sleep, the editing process happens, right? Because then you get back the next day and it's like, it's right brain, left brain. It really, truly happens. So you could be I watch reality TV. I watch bad reality TV.
Yes. And everyone has their thing. When I was in grad school, I had an amazing professor, Honor Moore, and she used to say napping was the most important part of the writing process. That if you're writing and you get everybody has that moment where you're writing, you get so tired. She said, go with it. Ask yourself a question as you're falling asleep. Where is this story going? Why am I writing this? Whatever the question is that you're struggling with, take a nap. And you will wake up with the answer. It helps.
So I want to get back to your structure and your braiding in, like taking something like chess and equating it to how you're dealing with your marital situation and the cow and all that. Is braiding something that you naturally do with your essays, or is that something you thought the construct of it would really add this extra layer, or both perhaps?
I think it is a little bit of both. I'm trying to think because some of the essays do not have that, and some of them are explicitly braids, and some of them are lyric, right? I did want to play and offer the reader a few different types of essay within this larger story. But that is my comfort zone, I would say now. I'm not sure it always was, but for whatever reason, I process when I can hold something over here and shoot the story through it. And that's for me what that other element does. So recently I had a piece in the Atlantic about, going back to Vivian Gornick. The situation was divorce and getting into a new relationship and sort of single motherhood, trusting again. If you read it, the story is about squirrels, right? It's about my partner who was, during COVID, essentially helped some squirrels through a tough time on his windowsill, and they just stuck by him. And then the more I happened to learn about squirrels, they're sort of nature's single mother. And then I thought, well, that's interesting. Again, that little writer brain was like, all right, store that. And
Squirrel.
yes, exactly. Store it in here. And so as that progressed, right, the more I researched, and research is such an important element, I think, because I could have researched and it could have just fallen flat and not been a good parallel. But the more I researched, the more I realized, oh my gosh, this really speaks to something in here about how I'm feeling. And so with the cow, for example, same exact thing, this little Free Martin calf that, this is why I love nonfiction. If I wrote a short story where the farmers up the road named this little cow after me, and then here I am in that period trying to figure out what is my place as a woman who is in her early 30s. I'm not a mother yet. And in that world, women's value is in pies and babies. And there are very set identities, and I didn't have one. And so then watching this little calf, who it turns out the calf was a Free Martin, which only when I started researching did I even remember that in Huxley's Brave New World, 85%, I think, or some high percent of the females are Free Martin, and it means sterilized. And so all of these, oh my gosh, it's fascinating. And I just get really into the research. And I would say I probably only use about 20% of what I research. That's what ends up on the page. But for me, being able to look at that cow made it easier to look at myself. And so it was the refraction that happens. And it's easier for me to talk about those ideas when I'm talking about the cow than it is to say just baldly, it's Virginia Woolf, right? It's the moth. If she started that gorgeous essay saying, I'm feeling really depressed today and I'm sitting at my desk, right? Nobody would probably read that. But this idea that I'm watching a moth, is the moth going to live or die? That sort of showing as instead of telling, I think that naturally forces a writer, when you've got that other idea or image or person or situation that you're refracting your story against, you're already in the showing mode, and it forces you into that.
That's so fascinating, because it's like taking an external, but the personal is still there. It's like it enables you to share even more, because you start with this image or this person or this other that you can then, like you said, shoot the idea into. So I love that. Well, you cover some really difficult situations in your book. You cover 9/11 in such a beautiful way, and you use the Intrepid as kind of a framework for that. Health issues, your ex's health issues, which you had to deal with very soon after you got married, almost immediately after. Car accidents, divorce, child protective services, unsavory people, anti-Semitism. How did you make the choice on what to conceal in the book and what to reveal for each situation?
Thank you for coming at that question with the assumption that there were choices made. I think I recently oversaw a panel, and it was with a bunch of women. It was called Motherload and the Tripwire of Writing Real Family. And when we met before the panel, the one thing that everyone had in common was that often people would come to them and assume that everything was on the page, right? I mean, you're a writer, that's not how it works. And so I think that's a really important place to begin, right? That there are, in the same way that when I research, maybe 20% ends up on the page. Gina Frangillo recently, I watched an event with her, and she said, there is no such thing as a tell-all memoir. There can't be, right? You could never tell all, even if you wanted to. And, obviously here it's a literary memoir, the essay, the form, all of that comes first. That's my goal. The goal is the story, and the situation is there to support the larger art, right? Now, that said, everything in this book is true, is real. It is my actual family. It is my actual life and my actual joy and my actual heartbreak, and also other people's. And so I think the important thing for when I was moving through these same questions, my agent, when we were talking about this book, I didn't want it to be a divorce book. And she said, it's not a divorce book. She said, every divorce starts as a love story. And it was really important to me to show that part, because that's why it matters, right? And so I wanted, and I think the Stoneboat essay, which has child protective services involved, I try to grapple with that on the page in terms of, where are my ethical lines? Am I covering my children's bodies? Am I covering other people's bodies and emotions? And for me, it was very important to, often I would hit a section and it would feel wrong, where something wasn't working in the line or just felt off. And usually it would be because I was either taking liberties in terms of moving outside of my observation, something that I could know, right? Where I was putting an emotion or stepping outside, describing a scene that I wasn't present for, that I thought this is probably how it happened. So for me, it was really about making sure that as the chronicler, as the observer, really it comes from, I think, being a journalist at the beginning before a memoirist, making sure that I am describing things that I know, that I saw. If it's an emotion, it's mine. I'm not implanting emotions in other characters, and fact checking, right? So going back as well as possible to double check, fact check, is this really how it happened? And I think there's never an easy answer. And I wanted to make space for other people's stories and always write with the knowledge that whatever other character was in the scene with me might have a completely different experience of that scene. So what is important for me for this book is that what I'm saying is this is my experience and only mine, not the experience.
By that same token, was it important to you to show the transformation, like at the end, that you and your ex, you came out, you're co-parenting, you're getting along, you're, moving forward in your life? Was that an important element of your story? Because yes, it's a story about divorce, but it's a story about finding yourself, finding your creativity. I mean, it's interesting. We both have a traditional publishing background. You worked in Highlights and other publications. I work for Woman's World. And, so we both have that beginning, which I think is a great beginning for a writer, an editor, or a teacher. So what was your feeling about that whole transformation?
I do think that Suburbia was the right place to end. And I think for folks who have not gone through the process of divorce, and this is the same for me before I went through it, it seemed like a very easy before and after. You're married, then you're divorced. And it's so much more complicated than that, especially when children are in the picture. And so I wanted to show a realistic portrait, and that's why the title is The Leaving Season, like leaving, because it's not past tense, right? It will never be past tense. And season, because it is a long, and any kind of leaving is that, right? You have to have the desire for something different. Then you have to speak it aloud. Then you have to act on it. Then you have to actually do the leaving. And even afterwards, it doesn't mean that was erased.
Right.
And so it was important to me and to honor him, right? I think, and I don't know if he would agree with this, but I think that we are both such better parents now. For me, becoming a single mother was the absolute best thing for my identity as a mother and my family. It was, I was so terrified of it, but it really was a beautiful transformation. And so when my agent says, well, it starts as a love story, I think it ends as a love story too, just not between the two people that it started with.
Right. Like finding your love and your value in yourself. Did he read it before you put it out there, or no?
Well, he's read a lot of it, actually, because some of it was published when we were still together. But no, and I wanted to make space for him to choose not to. He's not named.
No, you call him R throughout. So
yes.
That's a very specific decision that you made, not to use his name.
Yeah. And I think that goes back to your earlier question, in the same way that I don't name my children. So they can choose their relationship with this book in the same way that he can. They can choose to never read it. They can choose to read it and see themselves, I hope. But what's important to me is that this is my story, and I'm not claiming that it's anyone else's.
So there are so many themes in your book. And then when you get to the point where you had bookshop,
Yes.
right? This is where, yes, you've already been a literary citizen, you've been writing for publications, but this is really where I feel that you began to build your network with the literary community in a very tangible way. So not everyone can have their own bookshop. What do you recommend that writers do to build this kind of thriving, supportive network that you developed and created for yourself?
I'm glad that you were able to see that. And I think you're right that it is such an important part of being a writer, and you don't need to own a bookshop. to make that happen. But I do think that every writer should have a bookshop in terms of one that they feel is theirs. And I know that's the whole reason I opened that bookshop is because we had no bookshop. I grew up without a bookshop. So I will say it doesn't need to actually be a bookshop. For me, growing up, it was the library, right? Just a place of books. That could be a neighbor's. I remember, and I write about it, that first apartment, we had a lot of books in my house growing up, but when I went and cat sat for this particular lawyer in the book, and I remember the elevator opening up and she had an entire wall of books. And I just thought, you can do that, and I realized she's read these, right? This is a collection that she has put together over decades. And now I have that myself. But before that, I didn't know the possibility. And until you're standing in a room full of books, you don't know. And I think for me, one beautiful way of building that kind of network was reading series. So when I was in grad school and classes, actually, whether that's a formal MFA or journalism school or something like that, or continuing ed, something. I have a lot of writer friends who have their own classes. That's where you find your other book people. But the bookshop, I think, is a great place because that is where I built community when I really needed it. But it wasn't always around books. It was just book people. And so you're able to have that one common thing to talk about. And then you realize, oh my gosh, we also have all this other stuff in common too.
It's just wonderful that you have that. So we've talked about so much, and I want to know what's next for you, Kelly.
Well, hopefully I can get through the next month. And it's always the best and worst question, right? I am circling around an idea and I'm thinking, again, I love research and I'm working on a story that involves my great-grandmother, and she was in vaudeville. And I love that time period. And what occurred to me as I was sort of researching and looking at old images and I have her old diary, and she died in, almost 100 years ago. And so looking at those two time periods, she was a vaudevillian that was funny and bawdy, not sexy. So she was smart, sassy, a real modern woman in a time where she couldn't even vote, right? So she was this really amazing, strong person, strong woman in a time period of change. And I feel like now in 2023, in many ways, we feel like, oh, well, we're so much better off than we were 100 years ago. And looking at her story, it really made me question that. And then she made some really difficult decisions about ambition, art, and motherhood. And I think a lot of the same things that she went up against, women are still going up against every day in 2023. And so I'm interested in sort of, again, shooting 2023 through this idea of a woman who was alive 100 years ago. And are we really that different today?
Would you do it as a memoir or nonfiction, or would you do it as a novel?
Oh, I hadn't even thought about a novel. Fiction terrifies me. I love reading fiction, but I don't know how to write it. So I assumed I would approach it as biography with sort of memoir involved, but I don't know.
Literary. Yeah, that's fascinating. And where can people find you on social media and online?
Oh, sure. I usually hang out mostly on Instagram, which is, I think, Kelly_Mc_Masters. And my website, kellymcmasters.com, is probably the easiest clearinghouse for any kind of events and things like that.
Great. And I'll put that in the show notes. Thank you again, Kelly. This has been such a wonderful, enlightening, insightful discussion. And everybody, this book is just chef's kiss.
Oh, thank you so much, Estelle. It's been lovely to speak with you, and your students are so lucky.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Follow me at EstelleSErasmus.com on my website and on social media, which is Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter. at Estelle S. Erasmus. And we're now on YouTube for Freelance Writing Direct. Follow along, and soon everyone will be reading what you're writing.